Hi everyone. Tonight we're trading your mattress for a woven reed mat, your ceiling for a genuine rainforest canopy, and your morning commute for a walk past buildings taller than anything humanity would attempt again for the better part of 1,000 years. Welcome to a great Maya city at the absolute height of its power, back when the phrase ancient ruins would have gotten you laughed straight out of the marketplace, because none of it was ruined yet. If these late-night detours into the deep past are your kind of thing, a like or a subscribe genuinely helps this odd little project keep finding new people. No pressure attached either way. Drop a comment telling me where you're tuning in from and what ridiculous hour it currently is on your end, because apparently there is always, somewhere, one very tired person wide awake listening to a stranger describe pyramids. Go ahead and settle in now, kill the lights if you can, and let the room go quiet. Because where we're headed tonight, the only white noise on offer comes from several million insects with very strong opinions. Before we drop you in, a few things worth wondering. Did a temple 20 stories tall really get built without a single metal tool? Was the chocolate actually good? Or was it just something you were obligated to look thrilled about in front of royalty? Could you survive market day without accidentally insulting an entire extended family? And what exactly happens to a civilization at its absolute peak that makes it go, seemingly overnight, completely quiet? You're about to find out. Congratulations! You've just woken up in a great stone city rising out of the Guatemalan rainforest sometime around 750 CE. The plazas are gleaming, the kings are thriving, and not a single person here has the faintest idea that within 100 years, all of it falls silent. Try to enjoy the view while it lasts. Let's pick up exactly where segment 1 left off. You surface out of sleep on a woven reed mat, and the first thing you notice is that the ceiling is doing something your ceiling at home has never done. Dripping, faintly, with the accumulated breath of an entire rainforest. Somewhere close, a howler monkey is making a sound like a very large man losing an argument. You're in a low stone house on the edge of a city that, in your time, exists mostly as a photograph on someone's desktop background. Here, it's just Tuesday. Around you rise plastered pyramids so white in the morning sun they look freshly painted, because, in fact, they were repainted constantly. You have exactly one job this morning. Try not to look as lost as you actually are. The air itself takes some getting used to. It's thick, humid, faintly sweet with rotting fruit and wood smoke, and it clings to your skin the second you step outside, the way a subway platform in August clings to you. Except this particular subway platform goes on for miles in every direction and is entirely made of jungle. Somewhere below the canopy, a toucan is making noises that sound suspiciously like commentary on your outfit. Beneath your bare feet, the plaza floor is smooth limestone, worn glassy by generations of sandals, warm already even though the sun's barely cleared the tree line. You can feel it through your soles, the way you'd feel sun-warmed pavement on the first genuinely hot day of the year, except this pavement has been walked on since before anyone in your family tree learned to read. Everyone around you seems to already know exactly where they're going. A woman balances a water jug against her hip with the kind of effortless posture that took her a lifetime to earn and would put your entire back out in about 4 seconds. Children dart between houses, doing chores you don't yet understand, and a man loading baskets of maize onto a tumpline slung across his forehead barely glances at you, one more disoriented newcomer among many. Nobody stops to explain the city to you. Nobody hands you a map or a laminated brochure with a smiling cartoon jaguar pointing toward the restrooms. You are, functionally, the tourist who wandered off the group tour, except the group tour ended roughly 12 centuries before you were born. What strikes you most, standing there blinking in the humidity, is the sheer confidence of the place. Nothing about this city apologizes for existing. The pyramids don't hedge. The plaster doesn't peel. Every surface has been built, plastered, painted, and maintained by people who fully expected it to still be standing the following year, and the year after that, and so on indefinitely. The same unshakable confidence you might have had about your job security, right up until the exact week it stopped being justified. For now, though, none of that has happened yet. The city hums along at what feels like the absolute height of its power, and you're standing in the middle of it in yesterday's clothes, mildly concussed by scale, wondering where on earth you're supposed to find breakfast. That, as it turns out, is the very next problem on your list, and it involves a resource this city has spent centuries quietly obsessing over in ways you have not yet begun to appreciate. Let's start with the thing that should have been obvious and somehow wasn't. There is no river here. Not a creek, not a stream, not so much as a suspicious puddle you could drink from in an emergency. This city sits on porous limestone that swallows rainwater the way a bad house guest swallows the last of your leftovers. So the entire population survives on a network of plastered reservoirs, catch basins, and causeways engineered to funnel every drop of the rainy season into storage for the dry months ahead. It is, essentially, a city-sized rain barrel operation, run with more precision than most modern water utilities manage on a good day. Forget to plan for the dry season here, and you don't get a strongly worded notice from the water company. You get shown the system almost immediately, because everyone in this city seems to understand it is the single most important piece of infrastructure they own. More important than any temple, more important than the king's own palace. The main plazas themselves are tilted, subtly, deliberately, so that rain sheets across the plastered surfaces and drains toward channels leading straight into vast reservoirs carved from old quarry pits, some of them holding enough water to keep tens of thousands of people alive through months without a single drop falling from the sky. Standing at the edge of one, you can smell the faint mineral coolness rising off the surface, a smell not unlike a well-kept swimming pool, Except this pool is also, quite literally, the only thing standing between this entire city and total catastrophe. The upkeep is relentless. Silt has to be cleared. Plaster linings crack under sun and need patching, over and over, by workers who spend entire seasons doing nothing but maintaining channels and basins most residents will never think twice about. The ancient equivalent of the utility workers you've never once thanked for keeping your own tap running. Priests bless the reservoirs. Engineers, though nobody here would use that word, quietly do the actual work of making sure the blessing has something to hold on to. It's an oddly reassuring division of labor. Someone prays for rain, and someone else builds the plaster channel that makes sure the prayer, once answered, doesn't simply evaporate uselessly across cracked stone. You try at one point to explain the concept of a tap you can simply turn on, water arriving from some invisible municipal system you've never had to think about. The person you're explaining this to looks at you with a polite, slightly concerned expression of someone humouring a man who claims his village back home is powered by moonlight. Here, water is never invisible. It is measured, watched, argued over in dry years, celebrated in wet ones, and treated with a seriousness that borders on religious, mostly because it effectively is religious, and also because there is genuinely nowhere else to get it. You start eyeing every passing cloud with something close to gratitude, a habit you never once developed standing in your own kitchen, twisting a faucet without a second thought. It's an impressive system, honestly. Right up until you consider what happens the day the rains simply decide not to show up on schedule. A thought that hasn't crossed anyone's mind yet, and one we'll be circling back to considerably later tonight. Nobody in this city gets dressed just to leave the house. They get dressed to announce something, and the something is usually status. Cotton textiles, dyed in reds and blues, pulled from insects and shellfish that took considerable effort to acquire, drape over the shoulders of anyone who matters, while jade beads, feathered headdresses, and the occasional jaguar pelt separate the merely wealthy from the genuinely untouchable. If you're a commoner, your wardrobe is simpler, practical, woven from local cotton, and about as flashy as your average Tuesday errand outfit. If you're nobility, you are, in effect, wearing a resume, and everyone around you is reading it instantly, whether you like it or not. You get handed a plain woven loincloth and an unremarkable cotton mantle, which tells you everything you need to know about your current social ranking, and you wear it without complaint. Mostly because the alternative, watching a noblewoman glide past in quetzal feathers and jade ear spools the size of your thumb, has already made the hierarchy here perfectly clear. The dye work alone is a small miracle of patience. That deep, saturated red everyone seems to favour comes from crushed cochineal insects, thousands of them, boiled down and processed by hand into a pigment so vivid it makes your own closet look like it was assembled entirely from damp cardboard. The blue, rarer and more prized, comes from a pigment so specific to this region that chemists centuries later will spend actual careers trying to figure out exactly how it was made, and why it refuses to fade. Jade, meanwhile, functions less like jewelry and more like a small wearable bank account. A jade bead isn't simply pretty, it's a visible unit of wealth, status, and connection to the gods. Since jade's green color links it symbolically to water, growth, and the maize that keeps this entire civilization fed. Nobles layer it on with the enthusiasm of someone who has just discovered a new tax bracket and wants everyone to know about it. Ear spools stretching the lobes, pectorals hanging heavy across the chest, a look that reads unmistakably as I am extremely important and also possibly uncomfortable. You try lifting a ceremonial jade pectoral someone set down for a moment and are genuinely startled by the weight of it, roughly equivalent, you'd guess, to strapping a dinner plate to your sternum and calling it fashion. Feathers complete the picture, and not just any feathers. Quetzal plumes, brilliant iridescent green, traded up from distant highland forests at enormous cost, crown the heads of kings and high priests in headdresses so elaborate they practically require their own support staff to keep upright. You watch one noble attendant spend what feels like an entire hour arranging a single headdress, adjusting each feather with the focused intensity of someone assembling a very expensive, very fragile piece of furniture. It occurs to you that this is, in essence, an ancient red carpet, minus the actual carpet, plus roughly 40,000% more jade. By the time you're dressed and standing among the crowd gathering near the plaza, you've learned the first rule of this city's social fabric without anyone having to say it aloud. Here, clothing does the talking, and yours, quite frankly, isn't saying much of anything at all. Here's a beauty standard that will make your skincare routine look like a rounding error. Long before you could form memories, someone strapped a board to your infant's skull and gently, deliberately reshaped it, because a long, sloping forehead was considered elegant among the elite. Add in a bead dangled in front of a baby's eyes to encourage a fashionable crossed gaze, and later, a dental specialist filing small notches into your teeth to fit tiny jade or pyrite inlays, and you begin to understand that beauty here was not found. It was constructed, deliberately, starting in the crib, the same way a modern parent might agonize over the right preschool, except with considerably more skull involved. You get a first-hand look at the process when a mother down the row proudly shows off her infant, whose forehead has been bound between two padded boards for the past several weeks, gradually flattening and elongating the skull into the sloped profile everyone here considers refined. The baby, for what it's worth, seems entirely unbothered, cooing happily, which is more than you can say for your own reaction watching the procedure, something between admiration and mild horror, not unlike watching someone's toddler get their ears pierced back home, except scaled up considerably. The logic, once explained to you, makes a strange kind of sense. A striking, elongated head silhouette instantly signals noble birth, the same way a particular haircut or a particular brand name might silently communicate status in your own world, minus the returns policy. The crossed eyes take a similar amount of deliberate, patient effort. A small resin bead dangled just in front of an infant's nose for months at a stretch trains the eyes to converge slightly, a look considered genuinely beautiful here, associated with certain deities and, again, unmistakably upper class. You find yourself trying, unsuccessfully, to cross your own eyes in a nearby polished obsidian mirror, and manage only to look like someone attempting long division under duress. Then there's the dental work, which might be the most impressive detail of all. Skilled specialists, using nothing but stone drills and enormous patience, carve precise small notches and depressions into the front teeth of the well-to-do, then set in tiny inlays of jade or gleaming pyrite, a smile that, when you catch it in direct sunlight, genuinely sparkles. It's cosmetic dentistry, roughly 1,000 years ahead of schedule, minus the anesthetic, minus the appointment reminder text, and minus, one assumes, a great deal of the patient's composure during the procedure itself. Taken together, the whole beauty regimen amounts to a lifetime project, started in infancy and finished by adulthood, all in service of a look nobody in this culture considers optional if you want to be taken seriously. You catch your own reflection again, unmodified forehead, uncrossed eyes, plain, undecorated teeth, and understand immediately, without anyone needing to say it, exactly how far down the social ladder you're currently standing. Breakfast, such as it is, starts with maize, because in this civilization, maize is not simply a food, it is roughly 90% of the entire philosophical worldview. You grind it, soak it in lime to unlock its nutrients through a process your future descendants will call nixtamalization and will not appreciate nearly enough, and turn it into a thick corn gruel or flatbread eaten with beans, squash, and whatever chili you can tolerate before noon. There is no coffee. There is no cereal aisle. There is a woman a few doors down, slapping dough between her palms with the rhythm of someone who has made 10,000 tortillas and will make 10,000 more. And you eat what she hands you, gratefully, because arguing about breakfast is not a luxury available to you here. The grinding alone takes real effort, a stone mantle rolled back and forth across a metate, corn kernels crushed into paste with the kind of steady, repetitive labour your forearms have never once been asked to perform before 9 in the morning. It's loud, rhythmic, almost meditative once you find the motion. The domestic equivalent of a coffee grinder, if your coffee grinder took 45 minutes and left your shoulders aching. The lime treatment that follows, soaking and cooking the kernels in a mineral solution, sounds fussy, until you realize it's the reason this population isn't riddled with the nutritional deficiencies that plague other maize-dependent societies elsewhere in the world. A genuine nutritional breakthrough that nobody here would ever think to brag about, because it's just how breakfast has always been made. The smell hits you before the food does. Warm masa cooking on a clay comal, faintly smoky, faintly sweet, mixed with the sharper scent of chili and the earthy background note of beans that have been simmering since well before dawn. You eat cross-legged near the doorway, balancing a warm tortilla in one hand, and it occurs to you that this is, essentially, breakfast burrito culture roughly 1400 years early, minus the foil wrapper, minus the drive-through window, plus a genuine risk of your host judging your rolling technique. Beans and squash round things out, planted alongside the maize in the same fields, a companionable trio of crops that support each other agriculturally as much as they support each other on your plate. It's a diet built entirely around what actually grows well here. No imported grains, no seasonal produce flown in from somewhere else, just an intensely local, intensely practical way of eating that modern nutritionists half a world away will eventually rediscover and market back to your own descendants at considerable markup. You finish eating, wipe your hands, and realize you feel, against all odds, genuinely full and reasonably energized, which is more than you can honestly say about most mornings back home, involving a granola bar eaten standing up in a kitchen. Somewhere nearby, a much more interesting drink is being prepared, one reserved for people with considerably more status than you currently have, and you're about to get your first, thoroughly humbling taste of it. You've heard the word chocolate and pictured something sweet, wrapped in foil, sitting in a vending machine. Forget that immediately. What's poured for you here, usually into a tall, cylindrical vessel, and only if you've got some standing to speak of, is a bitter, frothy, chili-spiked drink made from ground cacao beans, poured back and forth between containers from a height specifically to build up foam, because texture apparently mattered as much as flavor. Cacao beans double as currency in this economy, meaning the drink in your hands is, quite literally, liquid money, and also meaning that spilling it is less an embarrassing accident and more a minor financial crisis. You watch the preparation happen up close. Roasted cacao beans ground on a heated metate until they release a dark, glossy paste, mixed with water, chili, sometimes a touch of honey or ground achiote, then procrastinatically from one vessel into another held some distance below, over and over, until a thick head of foam rises to the top. The pouring itself is practically a performance, and you get the distinct sense that a host who fails to produce sufficiently impressive foam is judged roughly the way a modern barista might be judged for a sad, flat latte art attempt. The smell alone is intoxicating. Dark and roasted, edged with a spiciness you weren't expecting. Nothing like the sugary version your own century eventually settles on. Your first sip catches you completely off guard. It's bitter, sharply so, with a slow building heat from the chili that creeps up the back of your throat, and absolutely nothing like the sweet, milky memory the word chocolate conjures in your own head. You do your best not to visibly recoil in front of your host, the way you might force a polite smile through a shot of unexpectedly strong local liquor handed to you on some overseas trip, nodding enthusiastically while your taste buds silently file a complaint. Someone nearby seems mildly amused by your reaction, which tells you this is a fairly universal experience for anyone unprepared for it. What makes the whole thing more remarkable is the sheer value packed into your cup. Cacao beans are counted, stored, and traded as currency throughout this economy, meaning a market vendor might price a woven blanket or a basket of tomatoes in a specific number of beans, and a particularly good year for cacao harvests functions less like a bumper crop and more like an entire regional economy suddenly flush with cash. Drinking chocolate, then, isn't simply refreshment. It's closer to sipping directly out of the local currency reserve, a habit reserved almost exclusively for rulers, priests, and warriors being honored for some notable feat, which is roughly how your own society would react if someone started casually drinking from a pile of $100 bills at breakfast. You finish the cup slowly, partly out of politeness, partly because you genuinely don't want to waste what you've just realized is essentially cash, and set the vessel down feeling both more sophisticated and more broke than you did 5 minutes earlier. It's an odd sensation, being simultaneously honored and financially diminished by a beverage, and it is, without question, unlike any breakfast drink you've ever previously had strong opinions about. Step out into the great plaza, and the scale of the place hits you the way a genuinely enormous building always does, all at once and slightly too fast to process. Twin pyramids rise on either side, faced in white stucco, crowned with roof combs that once could be seen for miles over the jungle canopy, because subtlety was never really the assignment here. Somewhere above you, priests and nobles climb steep, narrow stairways deliberately built to be difficult, so that reaching the top felt like an achievement reserved for people who mattered. Down below, you're just trying not to trip over a carved monument while craning your neck upward like every other visitor this city has ever had. The stairs alone are almost comically steep, each step barely wide enough to fit half your foot, a design choice you initially assume is a construction error until someone points out, patiently, that it's entirely intentional. Climbing to the top of a temple is supposed to feel like an act of devotion, a genuine physical effort that leaves you slightly breathless and appropriately humbled by the time you reach the summit, the architectural equivalent of a nightclub with an intentionally punishing dress code, designed to keep out anyone who hasn't earned the climb. You attempt it once, hands nearly scraping the steps in front of you for balance, and arrive at the top considerably less composed than the priests who do this daily without apparent effort. From up there, though, the view justifies every aching muscle. Jungle canopy stretches unbroken in every direction, an endless green horizon interrupted only by the white plastered peaks of other temples poking through like the tips of icebergs, evidence of just how much of this city, this civilization, sits half hidden beneath the forest, even at its height. The roof combs towering above each pyramid, elaborately carved and painted, aren't merely decorative flourishes. They're statements, visible from a considerable distance, a kind of ancient skyline branding meant to announce, unmistakably, whose city this is to any traveller approaching from the trade routes below. Down in the plaza itself, carved stone monuments stand in careful rows, each one recording the deeds, lineage, and considerable self-regard of a particular ruler. Dates and glyphs, cut with the same permanence your own society reserves for cornerstones and war memorials. Except here, nearly every accomplished king gets one, whether or not the accomplishments in question entirely hold up to scrutiny. You run a hand across the carved surface of one, feeling the worn grooves of glyphs that have weathered centuries of rain and sun. And it strikes you that this is essentially an ancient press release, chiselled into stone, specifically so nobody could later argue with the version of events it presents. The plaza itself, meanwhile, hums with quiet, constant activity. Priests moving between temples in ceremonial procession, nobles observing from raised platforms, ordinary residents cutting through on their way to somewhere more mundane, all of it happening beneath structures that were built, quite deliberately, to make every single person standing there feel appropriately small. You stand at the centre of it all for a long moment, neck craned, entirely overwhelmed, and think, not for the last time tonight, that whoever designed this plaza absolutely understood the assignment. Society here runs on a hierarchy so clear it barely needs to be spoken aloud, though people mention it constantly anyway. At the top sits the king, treated as a semi-divine intermediary between his people and the gods, and beneath him a tiered structure of nobles, priests, scribes, skilled artisans, merchants and farmers, each with their own responsibilities, privileges, and a very firm ceiling on how far they can rise. You learn your place quickly, the way anyone learns an org chart on their first day of a new job, except here the chart is enforced by centuries of tradition and the occasional public ceremony, and there is absolutely no one to file a complaint with. You pick up the rules mostly by watching how people move around each other. A noble crossing the plaza gets a subtle deference, a slight step back, a lowered gaze, gestures so automatic that nobody performing them seems to even register doing so. The same unconscious muscle memory you might apply without thinking toward a boss standing a little too close to your desk. Priests occupy their own particular tier, respected less for wealth than for their access to ritual knowledge and calendar calculations that ordinary residents rely on for everything from planting schedules to marriage dates, a kind of spiritual middle management whose authority nobody dares question out loud. Scribes and skilled artisans, the sculptors carving those endless monuments, the painters decorating pottery with impossibly fine detail, occupy a comfortable, respected middle position, valued for specific expertise, the way a particularly skilled tradesperson might be valued in any economy, minus the option of ever switching careers to something less physically demanding. Merchants, meanwhile, straddle an interesting space, sometimes quite wealthy from long-distance trade in jade, feathers, obsidian and cacao, yet still ranked beneath hereditary nobility, no matter how much actual money passes through their hands, an arrangement that would frustrate absolutely anyone in your own century who has ever complained about old money looking down on new money. At the bottom, structurally if not numerically, sit the farmers, the overwhelming majority of the population, whose steady agricultural labour is what actually keeps this entire pyramid-building, chocolate-drinking, ball-game-playing civilization fed. You spend an afternoon watching a farming family work a nearby plot, and it becomes obvious fairly quickly that whatever this society builds at the top, plazas, temples, elaborate court ceremonies. None of it exists without the unglamorous, unrecorded labour happening quietly at the bottom. A dynamic that, frankly, hasn't changed all that much in the intervening 1,000+ years. There's an odd comfort you find once you settle into your assigned rung on this ladder. Nobody expects you to suddenly climb it. Nobody's handing out performance reviews with vague promises of advancement contingent on synergy. Your place is simply your place, fixed, understood, occasionally uncomfortable, but at least refreshingly free of the anxious social climbing your own century seems to specialize in. You're not sure whether that's more or less exhausting than what you left behind, but you decide, for now, not to think about it too hard. Mostly because lunch, and an entirely new set of social hazards, is waiting for you down at the market. Market day is loud, crowded, and running on a rhythm you will need several attempts to master. Vendors spread woven mats across the plaza, piled with obsidian blades, salt, feathers, pottery, and cacao, while merchants who've walked in from distant city-states haggle in a mix of gesture, dialect, and unwavering patience. Everyone is polite right up until the exact moment the negotiation actually matters, at which point politeness becomes a weapon. You learn fast that the friendliest sounding vendor in the market is often the one most determined not to give you a fair price, and that losing a haggle here stings in ways a modern flea market simply doesn't. The noise alone takes some adjusting to. Dozens of overlapping conversations, the clatter of pottery being stacked and unstacked, a chorus of birds kept in cages for their feathers, all of it echoing slightly off the surrounding stone in a way that makes the whole plaza feel like a marketplace inside an unusually elegant parking garage. The smell shifts every few steps, wood smoke giving way to drying fish, then to the sharp mineral scent of freshly knapped obsidian, then to something sweetly floral from a vendor selling dyes and pigments. You wander between mats, trying to look like you belong, and failing almost immediately, because apparently everyone here can spot an inexperienced buyer from 20 paces. Obsidian is everywhere, and it's worth pausing on just how good this stuff actually is. Blades napped from volcanic glass, traded in from highland sources hundreds of miles away, hold an edge sharper than most surgical steel your own century will eventually manufacture. A fact that becomes uncomfortably clear the first time you run a careless thumb along one and immediately regret it. Salt, meanwhile, gets traded with an intensity that surprises you. Entire trade routes built around moving it inland from coastal saltworks, a commodity so essential that its price fluctuates with the same nervous energy your own century reserves for gasoline. Then comes the actual haggling, and this is where you discover just how badly you're outmatched. You attempt to negotiate down the price of a woven blanket, offering what you assume is a reasonably confident counteroffer, only to watch the vendor's expression shift into something between amusement and mild pity. The exact look a seasoned car salesman gives a customer who's clearly done zero research beforehand. Prices here move in cacao beans, small stone weights, or straightforward barter. Quetzal feathers for pottery, jade for a season's worth of salt, obsidian blades for baskets of maize. An entire improvised currency system, rumming with more sophistication than you expected from a marketplace with no cash registers, no card readers, and absolutely no patience for indecisive buyers. By the time you finally walk away with your blanket, having paid noticeably more than you'd hoped and considerably less than you feared, you've developed a newfound respect for whoever's job it eventually becomes, centuries from now, to write instructional books about negotiation tactics. Here, it's simply Tuesday. You clutch your overpriced blanket, nurse your wounded pride, and start heading toward the part of the city where, mercifully, nobody expects you to bargain for anything at all. The scribe's quarters, where a rather different kind of skill is about to make you feel equally out of your depth. If you're lucky enough, or unlucky enough, depending on your appetite for homework, to be trained as a scribe, your education starts with memorizing hundreds of intricate glyphs representing sounds, syllables, and whole words at once, carved and painted onto monuments, pottery, and folding bark paper books. Scribes are among the most respected people in the city, tasked with recording dynastic history, religious ritual, and, occasionally, some fairly pointed propaganda about how their particular king is doing compared to the neighbours. It's a genuinely elite profession, prestigious and exacting, and also one wrong brushstroke away from immortalising an error some future researcher will spend their entire career trying to explain. You're handed a brush, a small pot of dark pigment, and a folded bark paper book, and asked, with more confidence in your abilities than is remotely warranted, to copy a short passage of glyphs from an existing text. The brushwork demands a level of precision that your own handwriting, frankly, has never once achieved. Each glyph a tiny composed scene in itself, sometimes representing a full word, sometimes a syllable, occasionally both simultaneously, depending on context. A writing system so flexible and so complex that entire teams of specialists centuries later will spend their careers slowly cracking it open. Your attempt comes out lopsided, smudged, and almost certainly grammatically nonsensical, the visual equivalent of a toddler's crayon scrawl handed in alongside a professional calligrapher's finished manuscript. The scribe supervising you watches with the strained patience of someone who has clearly seen worse, but not by much. He explains gently that these glyphs aren't just decoration. They're a genuine, functioning writing system capturing full sentences, dates, names, titles, an entire language rendered in painted and carved form with a precision that rewards years of dedicated study and punishes absolutely any shortcuts. You think, briefly, of your own frustrated attempts at learning a foreign alphabet using a language app on your phone, and feel a fresh wave of humility. What makes the profession genuinely fascinating, though, is what scribes are actually recording. Dynastic histories get carved onto monuments in exhaustive, occasionally suspicious detail. Kings' birth dates, accession ceremonies, military victories, alliances, and, conveniently, almost never their defeats. A selective editorial choice that any modern public relations department would recognize instantly. You get the distinct impression, flipping through a partially completed bark paper book, that a decent percentage of what's being recorded here functions less like objective history and more like a very elaborate, very permanent highlight reel, curated entirely by the people it flatters. Religious texts round out the workload, calendar calculations, ritual instructions, mythological narratives explaining the gods' relationship to maize, rain, and the underworld, all requiring the same painstaking precision as the political records, since a miscalculated ritual date carries consequences considerably more serious than a typo in your own century's calendar app. By the time your lesson wraps up, your hand aches, your glyphs remain thoroughly unconvincing, and you've developed a profound new respect for anyone whose entire career depends on getting every single brushstroke exactly right, in a language where being close simply isn't close enough. Somewhere around this point, someone hands you a math problem, and you realize this civilization figured out something European mathematicians wouldn't manage for centuries: the concept of zero, represented here by a small shell-shaped glyph sitting comfortably inside a base 20 counting system built from dots and bars. It's elegant, efficient, and completely unlike anything you learned in school, which means your first attempt at working out a simple trade transaction goes about as smoothly as trying to do long division in a language you don't speak. The merchants, naturally, wait patiently while you fumble, the way anyone waits for a tourist mangling the local currency. The system itself, once explained, is almost frustratingly elegant. A single dot represents 1, a horizontal bar represents 5, and numbers stack vertically in place value columns based on 20 rather than the 10 you grew up with, meaning your entire mental math education, built patiently over years of base 10 arithmetic, is suddenly about as useful here as a European phrasebook in a country that doesn't speak the language. The shell glyph marking 0 isn't a minor footnote either. It's a genuine conceptual breakthrough, the idea of nothing as an actual placeholder value, something scholars in other parts of the world are still centuries away from formalizing in their own number systems. You attempt to calculate a simple trade, converting a handful of cacao beans into the equivalent value of a woven blanket, and watch your fingers hover uselessly over an arrangement of dots and bars that might as well be hieroglyphic Sudoku. The merchant watching you fumble does the calculation in his head in roughly the time it takes you to arrange your first column, then waits, with visible restraint, for you to catch up. The exact expression of a cashier back home watching someone painstakingly count out exact change in pennies while an entire line backs up behind them. What makes this all the more impressive is what the system gets used for beyond simple trade. This same base 20, zero-inclusive counting method underpins the entire calendar apparatus running this civilization. Vast numbers representing dates stretching back thousands of years into a mythological past, and forward, astonishingly, thousands of years into a future nobody watching those calculations will ever personally witness. Priests and astronomers use this number system to track lunar cycles, solar years, and the movements of Venus, with an accuracy that would embarrass most casual stargazers in your own century, all built on a mathematical foundation invented independently, without so much as a hint of outside influence from anywhere else on the planet. By the end of your lesson, you've managed to correctly write out the number for your own age, a small victory you celebrate with entirely disproportionate enthusiasm, and you walk away with a newfound humility about assuming ancient civilizations were somehow mathematically behind your own. If anything, you're the one behind, standing there next to a system of dots, bars, and shells that quietly solved a conceptual problem your own numerical ancestors would spend centuries struggling to catch up to. Time here isn't just tracked, it's practically worshipped. A 260-day ritual calendar runs alongside a 365-day solar calendar, the two interlocking like gears in a machine that only fully resets once every 52 years, an event significant enough to reshape entire ceremonies around it. Priests and astronomers track the movements of Venus with an accuracy that would embarrass most modern smartphone apps, and use those movements to decide when it's astrologically wise to plant crops, crown a king, or, notably, start a war. Your modern habit of checking a horoscope for fun starts to look almost quaint by comparison. You're shown the calendar system by a priest who clearly relishes the opportunity to explain something this elegant to someone this confused. The 260-day cycle, built from 13 numbers running alongside 20 named days, governs ritual timing, naming ceremonies, and personal destiny in ways that shape how people here understand their own lives. Not unlike how your own century still quietly checks a birth month against a zodiac sign, despite insisting, loudly, that nobody actually believes in it. The 365-day solar calendar, meanwhile, tracks the practical agricultural year, planting and harvest, the seasons that actually keep everyone fed. The genuinely dizzying part is watching the two systems interlock. Since they don't share a common factor, the exact combination of a specific ritual day and a specific solar day only repeats once every 52 years, a span roughly equivalent to a full human lifetime in this era, meaning many people will experience this particular calendrical alignment only once, if they're lucky enough to live that long. The anxiety surrounding that 52-year turnover is real and considerable. Entire ceremonies built around ensuring the world doesn't simply end when the cycle resets. Rituals involving extinguishing and relighting fires across the city in a coordinated, almost theatrical display of cosmic reassurance. You picture, briefly, the modern equivalent, a citywide blackout, followed by a synchronized relighting of every candle in town, purely to convince the universe that everything's still fine, and find yourself oddly moved by the collective effort involved. Then there's Venus, tracked with an obsessive precision that puts your own relationship with a weather app to shame. Priests and astronomers chart its heliacal risings and settings across long cycles, correlating its movements with favourable or unfavourable timing for warfare, coronations, and major ceremonies. An entire strategic calendar built around a planet most people in your own century couldn't reliably locate in the night sky if their life depended on it. Kings here genuinely time military campaigns to Venus's position, meaning an entire war can be scheduled around planetary movement, the way your own century might schedule a product launch around a favourable earnings report. You leave the lesson with a headache and a newfound appreciation for how seriously this culture takes the idea that the sky itself is quietly, constantly issuing instructions, if only you know how to read them properly. Somewhere down near the plaza's edge, meanwhile, an entirely different kind of scheduled event is about to get underway, one involving significantly more physical risk than checking a calendar ever could. Down near the plaza, a stone-walled court hosts a game played with a solid rubber ball that you're allowed to hit only with your hips, forearms, or thighs, never your hands or feet, which sounds simple until you actually try it and immediately understand why the players wear thick padding. The game carries deep religious symbolism, tied to myths about gods battling in the underworld, and in its higher stakes version, the outcome can carry consequences far more serious than modern trash talk and a bruised ego. You watch from the sidelines, wincing every time the ball connects, grateful, for possibly the first time all day, that nobody asked you to play. The court itself is an imposing, narrow alley flanked by steep, sloped walls. The whole space designed with the same architectural seriousness as the temples looming over it. Because this game is treated with a gravity your own recreational sports leagues rarely approach. The ball, made of solid rubber, harvested from local trees, is heavier and denser than you expected, and the crack of it, connecting with the player's padded hip, echoes off the surrounding stone with a sound uncomfortably close to a car door slamming shut. Players wear thick belts, knee pads, and wrist guards, protective gear that becomes considerably more understandable the moment you watch someone take a direct hit and simply absorb it, wincing without breaking stride. The rules, as best you can follow them, involve keeping the ball moving using only hips, forearms, or thighs, driving it past your opponents or through stone rings mounted high on the court's side walls, an achievement so difficult that scoring through the ring, when it happens, brings the entire game to an immediate, celebratory halt. You try, briefly, to imagine the modern equivalent, a sport combining the physical demands of rugby with the precision target shooting of basketball, played using only your hips and thighs, and conclude that your own century's athletes would likely find this absolutely humbling. What elevates the whole spectacle beyond simple athletic competition is the mythology wrapped around it. The game echoes ancient stories of hero twins battling underworld gods in a cosmic ballgame with the fate of the world at stake, meaning every match played here carries a faint symbolic weight beyond mere entertainment, closer to attending a deeply meaningful religious ceremony that also happens to double as an extremely physical sporting event. In its most consequential form, tied to warfare and captured nobles from rival city-states, the losing side can face genuinely severe ritual consequences, a detail that transforms your earlier assumption of harmless sport into something considerably more sobering. You watch a particularly skilled player drive the ball cleanly through the stone ring, and the crowd around you erupts with a roar that makes your own memories of a game-winning shot back home feel comparatively muted. Attendants rush the court, ceremony briefly overtaking competition, and you find yourself clapping along despite having only the faintest understanding of what exactly you're celebrating. It occurs to you, watching the visibly relieved winning team, that stakes this severe would put a remarkable damper on your own century's recreational softball league, where the worst possible consequence tends to involve someone sulking over the post-game pizza order. Feeding a city of tens of thousands out of tropical jungle soil is not a small trick, and the farmers here have worked out several ways to do it. Clearing small plots through controlled burning, rotating maize with beans and squash so the soil doesn't give up entirely, and in the wetter lowlands, building raised fields and terraces to manage both water and erosion. It's an entire agricultural science quietly running underneath a city famous for its pyramids. And it works, right up until it doesn't, which is a sentence you should probably remember for later. For now, though, the fields are green, the harvests are good, and nobody is thinking about later. You're handed a digging stick and invited, somewhat generously given your obvious lack of experience, to help clear a small plot on the city's outskirts. The process starts with felling and burning a patch of forest, the ash enriching the thin tropical soil just enough to support a few good growing seasons before the plot's fertility inevitably declines and the farmer moves to a fresh patch, letting the old one lie fallow and slowly regrow. It's a system your own century will eventually rediscover and rebrand as sustainable rotational agriculture, minus the part where anyone here gets a grant to study it. The maize, beans, and squash grown together aren't simply convenient companions, they're a genuinely clever agricultural partnership. Maize stalks providing a natural trellis for climbing bean vines, beans fixing nitrogen back into soil the maize depletes, and squash spreading broad leaves across the ground to shade out weeds and retain moisture. You plant a row yourself, clumsily, under the amused supervision of a farmer who has clearly done this since childhood, and managed to space your seeds so unevenly that he gently, wordlessly, redoes half your work the moment he thinks you're not looking. In the wetter lowland areas beyond the city, an even more ambitious system unfolds. Raised planting beds built up from dredged canal mud, creating elevated, well-drained growing surfaces, surrounded by water channels that double as transportation routes, irrigation, and even small-scale fish and turtle farming. It's an integrated agricultural engineering project that would be genuinely impressive coming from a modern agricultural university, let alone a civilization working entirely without metal tools or draft animals, relying instead on nothing but wooden implements, controlled labor, and generations of accumulated trial and error. The heat while working these fields is unrelenting, sweat soaking through your borrowed clothes within minutes, insects circling with an interest in you that feels personally motivated. And by midday, you've developed a genuine, hard-earned respect for anyone who does this labor daily rather than as a novelty afternoon experiment. You think, unhelpfully, of the sanitized farm-to-table branding your own century slaps onto vegetables at a premium price, and suspect the actual farmers behind that branding wherever and whenever they're working, would recognize this exhausted, sunburnt feeling instantly. By the time you're released from your agricultural duties, blistered and thoroughly humbled, you've gained a working understanding of exactly how much invisible labor sits underneath every temple, every carved monument, every extravagant feast this city produces. None of it, you now realize, floats on thin air. All of it, every last calorie, comes directly out of soil like this, coaxed reluctantly into cooperation by people whose names will never appear on a single carved monument anywhere in this city. Not everyone lives in the shadow of the Great Plaza. Most people live scattered across a sprawling residential zone stretching well beyond the ceremonial core, in modest pole and thatch houses clustered around shared courtyards, extended families living, working, and arguing within shouting distance of each other. It's less a single dense city and more a vast, loosely connected patchwork of neighborhoods linked by raised stone causeways, which means your commute home involves walking considerably farther than you'd expect from something that looks, from a distance, like a compact city centre. Suburban sprawl, it turns out, is not a modern invention. It just used to involve fewer cars and significantly more jungle. The walk itself takes considerably longer than you anticipated, following a raised limestone causeway that cuts arrow straight through dense forest, connecting one residential cluster to the next, like an ancient, oddly elegant highway system, minus the traffic lights and minus, mercifully, the traffic. Along the way, you pass smaller shrines, modest household altars, and the occasional worn footpath branching off toward yet another cluster of homes you can't quite see through the trees, evidence that this city extends considerably further into the surrounding jungle than its impressive stone core initially suggests. Your host family's compound, once you finally arrive, turns out to be a cluster of several simple pole and thatch structures, arranged around a shared central courtyard, each building housing a different branch of the same extended family: grandparents, parents, adult siblings, and their own children, all living in close, constant proximity. The houses themselves are modest but practical, wooden poles supporting steeply pitched thatched roofs designed to shed the region's heavy seasonal rains, walls sometimes left partially open to let air circulate through the relentless heat. It's not unlike a modern multi-generational household living on the same street, except here the whole extended family shares a single courtyard rather than merely a holiday dinner table. Privacy, you quickly discover, is a relatively foreign concept. Chores, meals, childcare, and conversation all happen within full view and earshot of whoever else happens to be occupying the courtyard at that particular moment. An arrangement that fosters an obvious closeness, but leaves you longing, almost immediately, for a door you can simply close behind you. You watch children roam freely between neighbouring compounds, apparently considered collectively supervised by whichever adult happens to be nearby. A genuinely communal approach to child-rearing that modern parents, juggling daycare logistics and overscheduled pickup times, would likely find both admirable and slightly overwhelming. What becomes clear, walking this network of causeways, connecting one residential cluster to the next, is just how much larger and more dispersed this whole settlement actually is than the compact, monumental core suggests at first glance. Tens of thousands of people live scattered across this sprawling patchwork, most of them never setting foot in the Great Plaza more than a handful of times in their entire lives. Their daily existence centered instead on this quieter, more domestic rhythm of courtyard chores and neighborhood gossip. By the time you settle onto a mat in your borrowed corner of the compound, feet aching from the walk, you've developed a newfound appreciation for exactly how much of this civilization's actual daily life happens well outside the frame of any photograph a future tourist might eventually take of the temples alone. Evening meals happen in the courtyard, shared among an extended family that somehow already knows everything that happened to you today before you've had the chance to mention it. News, gossip, and mild scandal travel through this neighborhood at a speed that would put any modern group chat to shame, mostly because everyone's courtyard sits close enough to the next that privacy is, at best, a polite fiction everyone agrees to pretend exists. You eat your maize and beans, listen to your aunt's opinions on the neighbours' questionable trading decisions, and quietly accept that in a world without television, other people's business is the entertainment. The meal itself is simple but satisfying. Tortillas warm off the comal, a stew of beans thickened with squash, a small portion of dried fish someone's cousin traded for that morning. All of it eaten by firelight as the day's heat finally starts to ease. Conversation flows easily around you, most of it in a rapid, familiar shorthand you can barely follow, punctuated by laughter, the occasional pointed silence, and at least one extended, deeply invested discussion about whether a neighbour's recent trade of jade beads for a substandard blanket was, in fact, a sign of declining judgment. You gather, from tone alone, that the neighbour in question will not be hearing the end of this particular transaction anytime soon. What strikes you most is how little separates this from any modern family dinner table conversation you've ever half listened to. The specifics change. Cacao beans instead of stock options, a questionable ball game bet instead of a fantasy football dispute. But the underlying rhythm, the gentle roasting of absent relatives, the recycled family jokes, the grandmother quietly steering every conversation back toward who's getting married and when, feels almost uncannily familiar. You start to suspect that certain aspects of extended family dynamics are simply a universal constant of human civilization, immune to language, era, or architecture. As the meal winds down, someone brings up a rumour involving a merchant family 2 compounds over, allegedly overcharging for salt during a recent shortage, and the resulting discussion takes on the energy of an actual courtroom proceeding, complete with competing witnesses, character assessments, and at least one dramatic pause for effect. You realize, somewhere in the middle of this, that you're witnessing the ancient, unfiltered predecessor of every reality show your own century has ever produced. Minus the cameras, minus the dramatic musical cues, but with absolutely none of the sincerity missing. By the time the fire burns down to embers and the courtyard gradually empties, family members drifting off toward their own sleeping quarters one by one, you've absorbed an entire evening's worth of local news, none of it delivered through any official channel. All of it more thoroughly researched and enthusiastically fact-checked than most modern gossip columns manage on a good day. You settle onto your mat, full, slightly overwhelmed by the sheer volume of information you now possess about people you've never actually met, and think, not without some fondness, that some things really don't change nearly as much as 12 centuries might suggest. Religion here isn't a Sunday obligation. It's the operating system underneath everything else, and one of its more intense expressions involves bloodletting rituals performed by kings, queens, and priests, using stingray spines or obsidian blades, drawing blood from the tongue or other sensitive areas as an offering to the gods. The blood, soaked into paper and burned, produces smoke believed to summon visions and ancestral spirits, and the ritual is treated with the gravity you'd expect from something considered essential to keeping the entire cosmos in balance. It's intense, it's serious, and by the standards of this era, it is simply Tuesday for the people at the top of the social ladder. You're permitted to observe one such ceremony from a respectful distance, and the sheer solemnity of it catches you off guard. The Queen, dressed in elaborate woven textiles and heavy jade ornamentation, kneels before a temple altar, while an attendant presents her with a stingray spine, and the ritual proceeds with a focused, unhurried intensity that makes clear this is not performed lightly. Bark paper is drawn through the wound and collected, later burned in a ceremonial brazier, the rising smoke believed to open a direct channel to ancestors and gods, an act of profound personal sacrifice made visibly, publicly, on behalf of the entire community rather than for any private benefit. The atmosphere around you shifts noticeably during the ceremony, drums and rattles keeping a slow, deliberate rhythm, incense thick enough to catch in the back of your throat, the crowd hushed in a way you haven't seen at any market or feast so far. You think, involuntarily, of the most solemn religious ceremonies you've witnessed back home. A particularly hushed midnight mass, perhaps, or a sombre memorial service, and realize this carries a similar weight, if considerably higher physical stakes for the person actually performing the ritual. What becomes clear, watching this unfold, is that personal sacrifice here isn't symbolic in the abstract way your own century tends to use the word. It's literal, physical, and understood to be genuinely necessary. The price paid by rulers to maintain their end of an ongoing cosmic relationship with forces believed to control rain, harvest, and the continued turning of the world itself. Kings and queens don't simply rule by inherited privilege here, they rule by actively, visibly suffering on behalf of everyone else, a burden of leadership considerably more literal than anything modern politicians campaign on. By the ceremony's end, the Queen rises, composed, evidently steadied by attendance, and the crowd's mood shifts almost immediately from hushed reverence to something closer to relief, murmured conversation resuming, a communal exhale after a ritual successfully completed. You walk away afterward, turning the whole experience over in your mind, genuinely struck by the seriousness of it, and think that whatever complaints you might have about your own century's political leadership, at least nobody's expected to draw their own blood publicly just to prove they're doing the job properly. Somewhere above the plaza, meanwhile, the man ultimately responsible for all of this, ritual, rule, and considerable self-mythologizing, is about to make his own entrance. The ruler of this city holds a position that goes well beyond politics. He's considered a divine or semi-divine figure, a living conduit between his people and the gods, responsible for maintaining cosmic order through ritual, warfare, and monumental building projects that will, whether he intends it or not, outlast him by well over 1,000 years. Carved monuments throughout the city record his lineage, his conquests, and his supposed divine mandate in exhaustive, occasionally exaggerated detail, because self-promotion, it turns out, is not a modern invention either. You look up at his image towering over the plaza and understand instantly exactly whose city you're standing in. You catch sight of him during a public ceremony, emerging from the temple atop the tallest pyramid, dressed in an elaborate quetzal feather headdress, jade pectoral, and jaguar pelt cape, an outfit so visually overwhelming that the crowd's reaction feels less like watching a politician address constituents and more like witnessing a celebrity arrive at an event specifically designed around his entrance. He speaks briefly, his voice carrying across the plaza with the help of the space's careful acoustics, invoking ancestral kings, divine mandate, and the continued prosperity of the city under his rule, a speech that sounds, structurally, remarkably similar to any modern politician's carefully rehearsed public address, if considerably more heavily accessorized. The carved monuments surrounding the plaza make the messaging even clearer. Each stone slab records his birth date, his accession to the throne, his supposed lineage tracing back through generations of ancestral rulers, and a tastefully curated selection of his military victories, conveniently omitting, as you've come to expect from your earlier scribe lesson, any campaigns that didn't go quite so well. You find yourself standing before one particularly grand monument, comparing its glowing, one-sided account of a recent conflict with vague rumours you've overheard elsewhere in the market, suggesting the outcome was considerably messier than advertised, and think, not for the first time, that political spin apparently predates actual politics by a comfortable margin. What's genuinely striking, though, is how seriously the divine kingship concept is taken by everyone around you, not merely enforced from the top down, but broadly, sincerely believed by ordinary residents as well. The king's ritual bloodletting, his careful alignment of major decisions with astronomical events, his constant public performance of connection to ancestral and divine forces, all of it serves a real, functional purpose in a worldview where cosmic order and political stability are treated as fundamentally the same thing. Undermine confidence in the king's divine legitimacy, and you're not simply attacking a political leader, you're threatening the continued rising of the sun and the timely arrival of the rains. stakes considerably higher than anything attached to modern approval ratings. You watch him retreat back into the temple as the ceremony concludes, the crowd slowly dispersing back into their normal daily routines, market stalls, courtyard chores, the ordinary rhythm of the city resuming almost immediately beneath the shadow of a ruler who, for however many more decades fate allows him, holds a job description somewhere between president, high priest, and living deity. It's an enormous amount of responsibility resting on one very elaborately dressed set of shoulders, and you get the distinct impression, watching him disappear from view, that he's fully, uncomfortably aware of exactly how much is riding on his performance. War here isn't chaotic or spontaneous, it's scheduled, sometimes timed to the movements of Venus itself, and waged against rival city-states locked in generations-long rivalries over trade routes, tribute, and prestige. This city's great rival lies to the north, a powerful kingdom whose ruling dynasty spends the better part of 2 centuries locked in an on-and-off struggle for regional dominance, complete with shifting alliances, captured nobles, and monuments boasting about victories the other side would very much dispute. Watching 2 Maya superpowers maneuver against each other feels less like ancient history and more like a soap opera with slightly higher stakes and considerably sharper weapons. You get your first real sense of the conflict's scale during a tense council gathering, where advisors debate the timing of an upcoming campaign against the Northern Kingdom, consulting astronomical charts alongside more practical concerns about troop readiness and alliance loyalty. The rivalry, you gather, has simmered for generations, each side alternately gaining the upper hand, capturing enemy nobles, forging temporary alliances with smaller city-states caught uncomfortably in the middle, and commissioning triumphant monuments the moment fortune briefly favours them. Monuments that, tellingly, never seem to mention the periods when fortune very much didn't. The mechanics of warfare itself are smaller in scale than you might expect from the dramatic stakes involved. Skirmishes and raids more common than sprawling pitched battles. Warriors armed with obsidian-edged clubs, spears, and small shields, fighting in engagements that might last hours, rather than the extended campaigns your own century associates with major warfare. What matters most isn't necessarily territorial conquest in the way you'd expect, but the capture of enemy nobles, particularly rival kings, a prize far more valuable strategically and symbolically than simply seizing land, since humiliating or ritually incorporating a captured rival's leadership does more lasting damage to an enemy's prestige than any amount of burned fields ever could. You watch preparations unfold with a kind of nervous fascination, warriors receiving blessings from priests, the timing of departure carefully aligned with favourable astronomical positioning, and send-off that combines the anxious energy of a modern military deployment with the ritual solemnity of a religious pilgrimage. Someone explains, almost casually, that this entire campaign has been scheduled partly around Venus's current position in the sky, since certain planetary alignments are considered particularly auspicious for launching attacks, a level of astrological commitment to military strategy that makes even the most superstitious modern general look comparatively restrained. What strikes you most, standing at the edge of these preparations, is how deeply personal and dynastic the whole conflict feels, less an abstract territorial dispute between nations, and more an ongoing, deeply held grudge between two royal families who happen to command entire cities' worth of resources and manpower in service of that grudge. It's the geopolitical equivalent of two extremely wealthy, extremely petty neighbouring families feuding for generations over a property line. Except here, the stakes involve captured nobility, ritual sacrifice of high-status prisoners, and monuments specifically carved to mock the other side's setbacks. You watch the warriors disappear down the causeway, banners raised, drums keeping pace, and think, somewhat uneasily, that whatever the outcome, someone's scribe is already preparing the celebratory monument, regardless of how the actual battle turns out. Bedtime here does not mean quiet. As the sun drops, the entire rainforest seems to increase its volume rather than settle down. Howler monkeys, cicadas, and a chorus of frogs turning the night into something closer to a badly organized concert than a peaceful wind-down. Your house has no glass in the windows, no white noise machine, and no gentle silence to speak of. Just the accumulated sound of an ecosystem that has never once considered your sleep schedule. You lie on your mat under a woven blanket and try to convince yourself this counts as soothing background noise, mostly because you don't have another option. The howler monkeys in particular take some serious getting used to. Their calls roll across the canopy in deep, guttural waves, a sound so improbably loud for the animal's actual size that you spend your first night convinced something considerably larger and more dangerous must be lurking just beyond the tree line. Someone eventually explains, with the patient tone of a person who has clearly answered this exact question from every previous outsider, that the sound is entirely normal, entirely harmless, and entirely inescapable. Roughly the natural world's version of a neighbour who insists on running a leaf blower at inconvenient hours with absolutely no consideration for anyone else's schedule. Beneath the monkeys, a dense layer of insect noise fills every remaining gap. Cicadas droning in overlapping waves, crickets keeping up a steady rhythmic pulse, and somewhere in the distance, frogs contributing an entire additional chorus, depending on how recently it's rained. It's genuinely impressive, in a way, how thoroughly layered the soundscape becomes once you actually stop and listen to it. An entire orchestra of creatures apparently unbothered by the fact that an exhausted, jet-lagged time traveller is desperately trying to sleep through their nightly performance. The heat lingers well after dark too, humid and heavy, clinging to your skin the same way it did that first disorienting morning, making the thin woven blanket feel less like warmth and more like a formality you observe purely out of habit. You shift positions on the reed mat, trying to find some configuration of limbs that doesn't involve direct contact with whatever's crawling along the floor nearby, and eventually give up, deciding that total surrender to the discomfort is probably the fastest route to actual sleep. What eventually gets you there, oddly enough, isn't silence, but rhythm. The overlapping calls settle into something almost predictable after enough exposure. a pattern your exhausted brain latches onto, the same way it might latch onto rain against a window, or traffic humming outside an apartment. You drift off eventually, genuinely asleep, lulled not by peace and quiet, but by an entire ecosystem's worth of noise that has apparently been running this exact nightly performance, unbothered and unchanged, for considerably longer than this city itself has existed. It occurs to you, right before consciousness finally gives out, that you'll need every bit of that rest, because morning brings company you have not yet been properly warned about. Nobody warns you properly about the insects. Mosquitoes are the least of it. There are biting ants that seem to hold a personal grudge, scorpions that occasionally wander in looking for somewhere warm, and a general sense that every surface in this city is, on some level, already occupied by something with more legs than you'd like to think about. The locals have their own remedies: smoke, certain plants, sheer stoic tolerance, and you adopt all three within your first few days. Because complaining about the bugs here gets you exactly the same sympathetic shrug it would get you on a modern camping trip gone slightly wrong. Your introduction to the local insect population happens almost immediately. A line of ants marching with impressive discipline directly across your sleeping mat, apparently entirely unbothered by your presence, and fully committed to whatever errand they're running. You learn quickly to shake out your blanket before bed, check your sandals before putting them on, and generally treat every dark corner of your borrowed house with the wary respect you'd normally reserve for a suspicious noise in an unfamiliar basement. Someone hands you a smouldering bundle of specific dried leaves to burn near your sleeping area, explaining that the smoke keeps the worst offenders at a respectful distance. A remedy that works reasonably well, provided you don't mind the faint, persistent smell clinging to everything you own. Mosquitoes arrive in relentless waves near dusk, and the bites accumulate steadily despite your best efforts, an itchy tally you track with the same grim resignation you might apply to a particularly aggressive allergy season back home. Scorpions, thankfully, are less frequent, but the one memorable encounter, discovered calmly sitting inside an overturned water jar, is enough to permanently alter your relationship with checking containers before reaching into them. The locals handle the discovery with a shrug and a quick, practiced removal, treating the whole incident with roughly the same mild irritation you'd show toward finding a spider in your shower. Mildly unpleasant, thoroughly routine, not remotely worth the panic you privately experience. What becomes clear fairly quickly is that this entire population has developed a genuinely practical working relationship with the ecosystem crowding in around every edge of the city. Certain plants get burned specifically for their insect-repelling properties. Certain structures get built slightly elevated off the ground to discourage crawling visitors, and an entire body of accumulated, generations-deep folk knowledge exists purely around minimizing, rather than eliminating, the constant presence of things with considerably more legs than you're personally comfortable sharing a house with. You think, somewhat enviously, of your own century's aerosol cans and electric zapping devices. Conveniences that would frankly solve about 90% of your current discomfort in roughly 10 seconds, and mourn their absence with real sincerity. Instead, you make do with smoke, vigilance, and a rapidly developing tolerance for minor daily indignities. And by the end of your first week, you've achieved a kind of resigned coexistence with your many-legged neighbours that would have seemed impossible on day one. It's not comfort exactly, but it's something adjacent to it. And out here, you're learning that's occasionally the best you can realistically hope for. Somewhere in the decades that follow the city's proudest years, small things start going wrong in ways nobody quite connects at the time. The rains, historically reliable enough to plan an entire civilization around, start arriving late, or thin, or not at all for uncomfortably long stretches. Reservoirs that once brimmed through the dry season begin running lower than anyone remembers. Nobody is panicking yet. A bad year is just a bad year, the kind of thing farmers have weathered before and expect to weather again. And if you told anyone in this plaza that the good years were numbered, they would have laughed you straight out of the market. You notice it first in small, easily dismissed details. A farmer mentioning, almost in passing, that this planting season feels drier than the last several combined. A priest quietly extending an extra ceremony beyond the usual ritual calendar, hoping additional prayer might coax the clouds into cooperating. Nobody around you treats any single instance as alarming. Weather has always fluctuated. Drought years have come and gone before within living memory, and the city's elaborate reservoir system exists precisely to buffer against exactly this kind of temporary shortfall. The way your own century might absorb a rough financial quarter without immediately assuming total economic collapse is imminent. What makes the situation genuinely insidious, though, is how gradual and easily rationalized each individual setback appears in isolation. A slightly smaller harvest gets attributed to bad luck, or perhaps insufficient ritual devotion, rather than any larger pattern worth seriously worrying about. Reservoir levels dropping a bit lower than usual get addressed with additional maintenance and slightly stricter water rationing, practical adjustments rather than emergency measures. You get the distinct sense, watching daily life continue largely unchanged around you, of a slow-moving problem that simply hasn't yet accumulated enough visible evidence to override the deep, reasonable confidence built up over centuries of this exact system working exactly as intended. There's something almost unbearably familiar about the whole dynamic, honestly. You think of modern conversations about long-term structural problems easily dismissed as isolated bad luck. A slightly warmer winter, a slightly worse storm season, each individually explainable, none of them individually alarming. The pattern only becoming undeniable once enough bad years have quietly stacked up behind you to make ignoring them no longer possible. Here, in this plaza, surrounded by gleaming, plastered pyramids and a genuinely thriving population, that reckoning still feels comfortably distant, a problem for a future that nobody currently standing here expects to personally witness. You walk past the central reservoir one afternoon and notice, almost accidentally, a thin band of dried, cracked mud ringing its edge, evidence that the water level has receded further than the surrounding plaster suggests it should have by this point in the season. Nobody else seems to be paying it any particular attention. Farmers and priests going about their business with the same practiced confidence as always. You file the detail away yourself, uneasily, the way you might notice a strange sound in your car's engine and decide, against your better judgment, that it's probably nothing worth mentioning just yet. As it turns out, that particular instinct, in this city's case, is about to prove catastrophically wrong. Here's a detail that took modern researchers digging through lake sediment and pollen samples to fully appreciate. Keeping this city's plaster gleaming white required burning enormous quantities of wood, century after century, to fuel the kilns behind every stucco temple face. Combine that with lands steadily cleared for farming, a growing population, and the forest that once buffered this valley starts thinning out, taking with it the soil retention and local rainfall patterns the entire agricultural system quietly depended on. It's the kind of slow-motion problem that's invisible year to year and undeniable decade to decade. The environmental equivalent of ignoring a strange noise in your car until the whole engine finally gives out. You get a first-hand sense of the scale involved, standing near one of the lime kilns on the city's outskirts, watching workers feed an enormous, steadily burning fire with cut timber, producing the quicklime needed to plaster yet another temple facade, yet another plaza floor, yet another gleaming monument meant to advertise this civilization's permanence to anyone approaching from the trade routes. The process is remarkably wood-intensive. Entire mature trees reduced to fuel for a single batch of plaster. A resource cost nobody standing here seems particularly worried about, mostly because the surrounding jungle has always seemed effectively limitless. An endless green horizon stretching in every direction as far as anyone can see. That assumption, you gradually realize, is exactly the problem. Centuries of exactly this kind of steady, reasonable-seeming resource extraction, wood for plaster kilns, cleared land for expanding farm plots feeding an increasingly large population, gradually thin out the forest cover surrounding the city in ways nobody at any single point in time experiences as a crisis. Each individual clearing decision perfectly justified by immediate, practical need. It's not unlike watching someone slowly overdraw a bank account through a long series of individually reasonable purchases. No single transaction alarming, the mounting total only becoming a genuine problem once it's already too large to easily reverse. The environmental consequences ripple outward in ways this civilization has no real framework for anticipating. Reduced forest cover means less moisture recycled back into the local atmosphere through evapotranspiration, which means reduced rainfall, which means, in an unfortunate and self-reinforcing cycle, even greater agricultural pressure to clear additional land in search of adequate harvests, which further reduces forest cover, which further reduces rainfall. It's a feedback loop that modern climate researchers, centuries later, will need satellite imagery, sediment cores, and considerable specialized expertise to properly reconstruct, but which, standing here beside this particular smoking kiln, looks for all the world like a perfectly ordinary, perfectly justified workday. You watch another load of timber get fed into the fire, the temple facade it's destined for already looking magnificent in your mind's eye, gleaming white against the green canopy behind it. And you can't quite bring yourself to blame anyone standing here for a problem that would take satellites and centuries of hindsight to fully diagnose. It's a genuinely humbling thought. Watching a civilization at its confident, thriving peak, quietly, unknowingly, consume the very resource its own long-term survival depends on. One perfectly reasonable kiln fire at a time. One of the eeriest signs of what's coming isn't a battle or a famine. It's simply silence. The kind that shows up in the archaeological record as an absence rather than an event. Monuments, once carved every few years to commemorate a king's victories and anniversaries, stop appearing. Construction projects that once reshaped the skyline slow, then stall entirely. Dynasties that ruled for centuries lose the resources, the stability, or simply the will to keep recording their own greatness. And city after city across the region goes quiet in a staggered wave that plays out over roughly a century. Nobody announces a collapse. The kings just stop talking, and everyone left behind has to fill in the silence themselves. You notice the shift gradually, the way you notice anything that happens slowly enough to avoid feeling dramatic in the moment. A planned monument meant to commemorate an upcoming royal anniversary gets quietly postponed, then postponed again, then simply never mentioned. Construction crews that once maintained a steady, confident rhythm of expansion and renovation across the city's temples grow smaller, less frequent, focused increasingly on basic upkeep rather than the ambitious new projects that once defined every ruler's reign. You ask at one point about a half-finished stone platform near the plaza's edge and get only a vague, uneasy shrug in response, nobody quite willing to explain why the work simply stopped partway through. What makes this particular kind of decline so genuinely unsettling, looking back on it with the benefit of considerably more historical distance than anyone currently living through it possesses, is how undramatic it feels from the inside. There's no single dramatic battle, no obvious catastrophic event anyone points to and says, clearly, this is where everything changed. Instead, There's simply a gradual accumulating quiet. Fewer ceremonies, smaller harvests, a court that seems subtly but unmistakably less confident than it once was. The same way a once thriving small town might slowly hollow out over successive decades without any single closure or layoff feeling at the time like the definitive turning point. You think, standing amid this quietly stalling grandeur, of modern institutions experiencing similarly gradual declines, a once thriving downtown slowly losing storefronts one at a time, a major employer scaling back operations year after year without ever issuing a single dramatic announcement. The kind of slow institutional erosion that only becomes fully visible once you compare photographs taken decades apart. Nobody currently living in this city has that kind of long view available to them. They simply experience each individual year as its own modest disappointment. This year's harvest slightly worse than expected. This year's ceremony slightly less elaborate than tradition called for, without ever quite connecting the dots into the larger, considerably more alarming pattern. By the time you leave the plaza that particular evening, the half-finished platform still sitting abandoned in the fading light, you've developed a genuinely uneasy feeling about this city's future. A sense that something significant is quietly, steadily unraveling just beneath the surface of everyday routine. Nobody around you seems to share your unease, going about their business with the same practiced normalcy as always, and you find yourself wondering, uncomfortably, whether that's simple resilience or something closer to collective denial. Either way, the silence, once you notice it, becomes impossible to unnotice. This is the part everyone's been waiting for, and the honest answer is messier than a single dramatic headline would suggest. Drought, exhausted soil, overextended trade networks, relentless warfare between rival kingdoms, and a political system grown too brittle to absorb any more shocks, all arrive at roughly the same time, compounding each other until the great ceremonial cities of the southern lowlands empty out over the course of decades rather than overnight. The plazas go quiet, the causeways go unused, and the jungle, patient as it's always been, starts reclaiming the plaster and stone, one root at a time. The Maya people themselves never vanished. Their descendants live across this region today, but this particular chapter of this particular city closes slowly, without a single grand explanation, which might be the most unsettling ending of all. You witness in your final days here not a single dramatic exodus, but a series of small, individually reasonable departures. A family deciding the harvest simply isn't reliable enough anymore to justify staying. A merchant relocating toward a smaller, less prestigious but more agriculturally stable settlement. A minor noble quietly abandoning a half-maintained residence near the plaza's edge. Each decision, taken alone, looks like ordinary, sensible adaptation to difficult circumstances, Precisely the kind of practical choice any reasonable person facing declining harvests and unreliable rainfall might make. It's only in aggregate, watching dozens, then hundreds, then thousands of these individually reasonable choices accumulate over successive decades, that the larger pattern becomes genuinely undeniable. The environmental and political pressures feed each other in ways that make any single cause difficult to isolate. Diminished rainfall stresses harvests. Stressed harvests strain the political systems built on redistributing agricultural surplus. Strained political systems struggle to maintain the elaborate ceremonial infrastructure that once reinforced royal legitimacy, and weakened royal legitimacy makes the whole social contract holding the city together considerably harder to enforce during exactly the moment it's needed most. Add generations of accumulated warfare between rival kingdoms, each conflict draining resources and manpower that might otherwise go toward weathering the mounting environmental pressure, and you have a genuinely compounding crisis rather than any single tidy cause. You take one last walk through the Great Plaza before your time here concludes. The pyramids still standing, still impressive, though you notice now, with your accumulated weeks of context, the small signs of strain you initially missed. A reservoir edge cracked and unrepaired. A half-finished monument abandoned mid-carving. A noticeably thinner crowd moving through spaces clearly designed to hold considerably more people than currently occupy them. It's not collapse exactly, not yet, not here. But you can feel, walking through it, the unmistakable sense of a system running on reserves it can no longer fully replenish. What actually happens next, you understand, unfolds gradually over the following decades, rather than in any single dramatic moment you'll personally witness. City after city across the southern lowlands, following a broadly similar trajectory. Populations dispersing towards smaller, more sustainable settlements. Monumental construction ceasing. The great ceremonial centres slowly emptying, until the jungle, patient and utterly indifferent to any of it, begins reclaiming stone and plaster alike. The people themselves don't disappear. Their descendants continue living across this region for the next 12 centuries and beyond, carrying forward language, tradition, and identity through every subsequent upheaval history throws at them. But this particular city, this particular gleaming, confident, thoroughly humbling place you've spent your visit getting lost in, quietly closes its final chapter, and closes it, characteristically, without ever bothering to explain itself. So there you have it. A city that rose out of the jungle with more confidence than any structure has any right to, dressed its kings in feathers and jade, drank its currency, argued over forks made of dots and bars, and somehow, despite every ounce of that brilliance, still couldn't outlast a few bad decades of rain. You climbed pyramids not built for comfort, ate breakfast that took real effort to earn, lost badly at haggling, listened to a jungle that never once considered your bedtime, and stood quietly by while an entire civilization convinced itself, right up until it couldn't anymore, that the good years would simply keep coming. It's easy, from this distance, to feel a little smug about it, to imagine you'd have seen the cracks in the plaster sooner than they did. But the people who built this place weren't careless, and they weren't foolish. They were doing exactly what people everywhere have always done. Trusting the rains would come again, because they always had. building beautifully for a future they had every reasonable right to expect. Their descendants are still here, in the language, the food, the faces of a region that never actually disappeared, whatever the empty plazas might suggest. So tonight, as you sink into your own quiet bed, no reservoir to check, no jungle chorus rattling the windows, no ledger of cacao beans to balance before sleep. Maybe spare a small thought for the people who once measured their whole lives by the sky. Their kingdom went quiet, but they never did. Rest easy. The rain, wherever you are tonight, is somebody else's problem for now.